Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. I am your host, Roy Kessel, and this week we are very excited to have with us Elizabeth Finlayson. Elizabeth is the CEO and lead coach of the Nonprofit Coach. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
We're excited to have you with us today. I know everybody's in the midst of dealing with the crazy coronavirus epidemic and pandemic, and there's a lot of challenges that go into issues for nonprofits in times of stress and times of emergency. But before we go into some of your recommendations in that area, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and how you got into the nonprofit space?
Yeah, well, thank you. So I got into the nonprofit world in early 2001, so right before September 11th. So I have fundraised through two recessions now, maybe going into our third. And in that time, I have worked at both large and small organizations, really with the intention of picking up best practices at our larger organizations. But I really love small and mid-sized organizations, and I love being scrappy and responsive and reacting to different crises. So it's actually really fun to then come and take those best practices and move them down to smaller organizations. So that's what I spend a lot of my time with. And yeah, I do strategic planning, fundraising, and then I have a suite of partners who do other fundraising services.
And so you've seen a lot of things then in almost 20 years of going through this type of work. And as you said, you went through 9/11, you went through some of the elements of the recessions. And I think we're in a challenging time for nonprofits, having spoken to a lot of the organizations in our network about what they're dealing with on the heels of this type of pandemic. What are some of the top challenges that you see from your perspective?
Well, I would say the first thing to know is just everybody is scared right now. And so I think nonprofits are scared when they're looking at their own organizations and they're looking at what's going to happen and how do we continue to pay for our programming that we think is so vital. And that's why we were doing this in the first place. But then the people that nonprofits are going to be communicating with, they're also worried. They're worried about their own health, they're worried about their family's health, and they're worried about their finances. And so I think one of the challenges a lot of nonprofits are looking at is in what way can and should I be communicating? You know, they're looking to themselves and saying, like, can I ask for money if I need money? Is that insensitive? How do I do that? So I think that's one of the challenges that I see nonprofits facing right now. I actually just got off the phone with a new client who said that he had not been able to be on the call at the appointed time because he was down to 4 staff and he was personally taking care of raccoons right now and doing blood draws. So I think it just goes to show that when people are being asked to stay at home, then the staff members aren't there to really conduct the vital work of our nonprofits.
And I think we're really in uncharted territories when you look at most of the items that are described as emergency situations or responsiveness, whether it's through earthquakes or hurricanes or blizzards or floods or anything else that's like that. They tend to be geographically isolated. And so the organizations have the ability to draw on support from other parts of the country, whether that's for staffing, whether that's for supplies, whether that's just for any other type of resources. Right now, everybody's kind of holed up in their own little world for the most part, even though I see cars driving right in front of me on an ongoing basis, but they're probably just going to the grocery store. So the challenge is when you're dealing with such large scale shutdowns, I think, as you said, everybody is nervous, and so how do you work with those organizations to really teach them, as you said, it's okay to ask for money. It's not necessarily a bad thing to do. It just may require a little bit of a different perspective in how you approach that. So give us some of your recommendations in those areas.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the things that that I'm looking at in nonprofits, I feel like there's two kinds of nonprofits right now when it comes to this kind of crisis really, is you are either a nonprofit in which this crisis is really affecting you because you're on the front lines of some issue related to it. So I was speaking to a health organization early in the week, and so they're looking at a greater need for their services, and their medical staff are being asked to not to travel. So you might have that kind of thing going on, or you might be in the other category where you're being asked to completely shut down. And I think in that category are like arts organizations, like you're being told not to do things. So how you communicate and how you respond will be based upon those positions. But I would say everybody right now is hungry for information, and they're hungry for valid information. Because there is a lack of trust right now in government, private sector, and nonprofits, this is a time for us to be getting in front of messages and to really be increasing trust. And I think one of the ways we can do that is communicating in an empathetic manner. So from that, we can be looking at, okay, right now people are worried about their own health and their own finances. Preface any communication with that. Don't be, just randomly asking people for money as though they're not going through something. Be sensitive to that, but then you can go ahead and say, and here are our needs if you are able to help. So I'd say like that's one of the things there. And I think if you're in that other category where maybe your nonprofit mission isn't a focus right now, how can you be helping others? I think one of the things that happens in our sector is we're so focused on getting resources because there's often a feeling there aren't enough resources and we're competing against each other, that we are not always as collaborative as we could be, but really all of us want to make the world better. So if we're going and we're getting out there and saying, okay, well, maybe my troupe of actors um, could be doing a food drive right now, or maybe my sports team is not allowed to play right now, but we could be doing a blood drive, we could be making sandwiches, we could be delivering groceries to elderly people. In that way, I think you can really be building trust in your organization.
Yeah, I think the collaboration piece is really critical. One of the things that I've always found frustrating in this space, and I know you and I have spoken about this previously, is how too many nonprofits seem to feel that collaborating is sort of part of a zero-sum game. In other words, there's $1 out there, and either you get it, I get it, or we split it in some equal number, as opposed to the concept that you and I working together might be able to enlarge in the pool from $1 to $3, $5, $10, whatever it is. I think that there's a lot of resources out there, and the challenge right now is in the mindset of everybody starving because they're worried about where that next bit of food comes from, or what other scarce resources there are. How do we help them understand that collaborating is still going to end up yielding a better return for them in the long run?
Yeah, and I think there are some examples in our sector where that is going well. I think you can see in a lot of the food pantries and feeding organizations, they're more networked together. So you've got places like the Greater Chicago Food Depository, which is garnering a lot of those resources and then distributing them in a way that actually makes sense. You can see that in some of the United Way organizations, or I was working at a homeless organization um, in Chicago when they started the 10-year plan to end homelessness, and they looked and they said, okay, well, some organizations have the hotline, some have the emergency shelters, some have the supportive services. How are we really wrapping around this issue, and we make sure we don't have too much of one kind and not enough of something else? And I think they're really smart ways the sector can work together, and this might be the kind of thing that propels us to do more of it.
So as you're looking at those collaboration efforts, you provided some great examples. When you're dealing with clients in the scope of an emergency, whether it's this one or any other emergency that comes up, how do you advise them to handle the efforts relating to events when they've got an event coming up that needs to be canceled. And for those of us that have been in this space, obviously this is extreme what's going on right now, but certainly there's event cancellations every year for various reasons, weather, illness, whatever else it might be.
Yeah, it's a really great point. And you're right, like a lot of organizations are dealing with that right now, but they do happen for other reasons at other times. And the other thing to keep in mind is a crisis can be like it is right now, externally driven, but crises can come from inside your own organization, and they can take you from by surprise. So it is really important to kind of look at like what are the steps. I think similar to how we were talking about these other components, it's really communication, communication, communication. When you look at your events, um, there are these different constituencies that are surrounding them. So, for instance, one of the first places to look is your own vendors. You know, what do the contracts say? Are you able to postpone? Can you cancel? Can you have it a different time? Can you change it to something virtual? The one of the ways that you're going to answer that is really by looking at your vendor relationships and your contracts. In a time like this, I would say you have a contract, which is a piece of paper, and then you also have a relationship. So I would pick up the phone and find out what's going on with them. And I think as we talked about, not only caring about ourselves and our own organization, your vendors probably right now are hurting. So, have that conversation empathetically. We can all be looking at what we can do to support ourselves. We don't want to come out of this a couple of years from now and say, well, there's no more hotels in our area, because they all shut down. So really looking more broadly, but that's a place to start. Looking at your sponsors. So Network for Good, who I work for, is a nonprofit technology company, and they put out this great piece about what to do when you're canceling an event. So one of the things is looking at your sponsors. They were expecting a certain amount of recognition from your event. What are other ways that you can do that? Can you do it on a website? Can you do it through your email blast? Can you do it through your social media? Is there something coming up that you can do? You can also, this is a time to look at any of those major donors. Hopefully you've been maintaining your relationships and really building up, particularly people at the higher dollar levels, so that this is a time you can call them and say, hey, would you consider just converting this straight to a peer donation? And allowing it to support the organization through this time. A lot of major donors, their only reason they're making that really large contribution to your event is because they're just trying to celebrate you and show up and have a good time. So I would say a lot of them don't mind making those kind of changes. And if they do, you can work to see what else you can do. The other great idea that came up was volunteers. If you're having an event, you probably were about to have about 20 practical strangers sometimes coming to help support your organization for an evening. Keep the same date and time and have them do something else for the organization. Even if it's something they're doing at home, can they be packing up materials? Can they be doing peer-to-peer fundraising on your behalf? Let them get the word out that this is going to hurt your organization, that your event is being canceled, changed, or postponed. Talk to your ticket buyers, allow them to have an option to get their money back. Because some people, they were just coming to come to a party, and see if there's an option on your site for donating back to you. Some people really were just coming to support you. And then really looking at where can you make up the lost income for the year? Can you go to some of your foundation partners for an additional gift? Go to your corporations, can you do some more appeals, or have an event later in the year? So those are some things you can look at if you're canceling an event.
And you've covered a lot of ground there. I think one of the things people struggle with on events is there's so many moving parts. And so
Yeah.
uh, there's certainly, if you've got an event coming up in a couple of weeks, you really don't have much choice, and there's not a lot of time to adapt and sort of restructure or recreate the
Mhm.
event in a virtual environment. Um, if you're looking 60 days out or 90 days out, when it may still be unlikely that the event is going to proceed in an in-person basis, you certainly have a little bit more time to evaluate what options are there. How can we create uh, an event that's got a good look and a feel on a virtualized basis? And one of the struggles, I was talking with other people today, is the difficulty of uh, virtual events. right? I think that
Mhm.
you can continue relationships, you can build existing relationships, but it's really hard to form that direct connection with somebody if this is the only contact that you've had. And when you have virtual contact, it's not the same as having a fundraising event or a gala with 100, 200, 500 people, whatever the number is. You don't feel, there's no way to recreate that energy. There's no way to have that sort of aura of the event that people can take away. And frankly, how many of us are going to sit in front of a screen like this for the 3 or 4 hours that an event may have taken place? And I think you've got that struggle with fundraising events. I think you've got that struggle with um, professional development, professional education type of events like conferences. How are you going to sit there and have somebody, they may come to a day and a half conference and get a lot of benefit out of the substance, out of the contacts, and the energy that's there, but they're not going to sit at a computer like we're sitting right now and having this conversation and really be that happy about sitting there from 8 in the morning until 5 or 6 o'clock at night. I think that's just unrealistic.
I think that it's true that we probably would have to adapt, make things a little bit different. I do have a client that was going to have a really phenomenal sounding major event in the next week. And I know they'd put together a lot of talent. So I think, nothing can replicate events. Anybody who puts on events knows that they're incredibly time consuming. From a fundraising perspective, they tend to uh, cost about 50 cents to raise $1. So they are the most expensive fundraising activity that people do. And the reason why they're important to stay as part of your, we'll say, fundraising diet is because they do bring in new blood, new energy, and they also excite your existing donors. All your donors and your the people who are following your organization, they're taking part in all those other parts throughout the whole year, but the event is a time to get to know other supporters and be in place. That being said, I think that a lot of things could be adapted and changed. Maybe they won't stay from 8 to 5 at their computer, but maybe they would do 8 to 2. And if you can keep your content really engaging, I think that can make a difference. The other thing is kind of just keeping in mind how people's brains work. So if you looked at people's brain scans after about 20 minutes, um, all that beautiful, like lit up color patterns in the brain kind of dull down. And so, building in things like stretches and snack breaks or music or things like that could make it a way that people will continue to feel, um, you know, that their brain is still awake and they're not just staring at something. And I would add social elements. Like if you're going to do a virtual conference or something, make sure there's times for people to just have a smaller breakout group as part of your conference, so they can get to know a few attendees really well, just like you would in a physical space. And I think that can make a difference as well.
Yeah, I think that the opportunity to break something down into smaller groups is critical. I've seen people using Zoom to do that in some networking events and other structures like that, because if you have a conference that has, say, 200 people that would have attended in person, while those people may be willing to mostly pay attention to some larger kind of panel discussions where everything's going on, you need to have a way to let them connect with people virtually and find an opportunity in groups of 5 or 10 or whatever the magic formula is, to interact and have time to learn from each other, learn about each other. So even though they were not able to be physically proximate to have that connection over the course of a day or a day and a half of a conference, maybe you can create a half dozen opportunities like that, so they really do get the the ability to connect and pick which sessions they want to go to, which breakout sessions they want to participate in, and carry on those conversations. And I think that as we look at our event, which is scheduled for the end of June, I would say we're kind of on that 50-50 cusp right now of whether that's going to be realistic to have people together in person, and whether people will know far enough or be comfortable far enough ahead of time to make travel plans, because you
Mm,
can't just decide that on uh, most people can't just decide that on a couple of days notice. So it's going to be interesting to follow. And um, I think one of the areas that comes up when you talk about the communication is a lot of organizations struggle to manage their communication systems at the best of times. So give us
yes.
a little bit of your feeling in terms of how and what organizations can be doing with this downtime, um, to strengthen their systems, to improve the integrity of the data that they have.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So, um, while people are sheltering at home or sheltering in their offices or social distancing, hopefully you have a system that is capturing names and data. You have some kind of database in place. Um, if not, see if you can get a free one right now. I would look at that or look at some affordable ones or see how you can be increasing your data integrity is one of the things that you could be doing. You can be going through your database and updating those lists and making sure most of the people I've ever worked with complain about their database and say, oh, there's so many records out of date. I've never worked anywhere that didn't have that, and just know that people are constantly moving, marrying, dying, having a baby, going to college. So it's always changing, and just know that some percentage of your records are inaccurate, but it's a good time to work on that. The other thing to know is if you look at a hierarchy of effective communication for fundraising, when I'm speaking about effectiveness, is social media is the least of effective for raising dollars. Email is far more effective. So that does not mean stop using social media. This is actually an excellent time to use social media, but it's a great time to try to convert people onto your email list, and so that they're getting more regular updates. We do know that donors who are communicated through multiple channels, so more than one channel of communication, direct mail, email, social media, etc., they give higher dollar amounts, they give more frequently, and they give for more years, and that leads to just an overall higher lifetime value. So one of the things we can be doing while we're communicating is really just getting people onto your list or moving them up that pyramid. Do some direct mail, or if you haven't been doing that before, or have some phone calls. Check in with your donors. I mean, we talk about empathy and communication. Really see how people are doing. You've got some elderly people, I'm sure, on your list. Make sure they're okay. See if they need groceries. I'm not saying maybe you're the one who's going to go out and do it, but we did just talk about your volunteers there, right? So, or if you've got your sports team and they're not doing anything. So, um, those are some things you can really be doing right now. And the other thing, just to keep in mind, where we talked about trust being low in the nonprofit sector, is to make sure that you're following some of the rules and guidelines. So when you're opening your mail and you're looking at your checks, you should have a second person there so nobody is able to pocket checks. I'm sure everybody at the people's nonprofits that are listening to this have great staff members who would never do anything wrong, but that is how trust gets lost in the sector. Is some one bad person does something that we don't appreciate. But having a second person there when you're opening mail, and having your dual data entry system, so you've got your finance and your development. If you've got two different people doing data entry and you're reconciling it every month, you are not going to miss those like random checks that suddenly would go missing. So those are some things you can really be doing right now.
And as you describe it, I think the challenge that a lot of smaller organizations face is how do you put in all of those controls in a smaller organization, because many times the individuals that are part of those organizations are serving multiple roles, and so they're really handling a variety of functions, and they're trying to figure out how do I come and now I've got to do something twice, right? Or I've got to have two different people to staff it to
Mm-hmm.
do to replicate these systems. And then you talk about data being outdated, right? When you now add the redundancy factor of I've got to update this in two different systems, how do you determine oftentimes then which system is more up to date? Somebody's updated one of the systems, and a lot of the systems, at least a lot of the older legacy types of systems, didn't properly document when a record may have been updated. So now you're comparing information, and I don't know if I've got Elizabeth's right information. Is this her current address? Which of the two systems has the right address and right phone number and, right marital status, whether it's getting married, getting divorced, all kinds of things. And I think there's certainly a lot of struggles that the organizations face as they do those things. And um, the challenge is, as you said, how often do you touch your donor? Because just like with every marketing message, you hear about individuals needing to have that about 7 times before they're going to act on a particular message. It's the same thing. So give us some tips and examples of how organizations can keep up that contact, because certainly when you remove in-person opportunities, that takes away what is one of the best and most effective ways to raise money.
Yeah, you're right. So some of those integrity system issues are tricky when you're a smaller staff. And particularly, some organizations, the second person is really a board member. Maybe there's only one staff, or it's an all volunteer group. I think the key is to have good policies and procedures and say, okay, this is the time of day this is done, and we all have a video call at 2 o'clock where we open up the mail. So you're watching what I'm doing. We're doing it together. That might be one of the ways that you can do that. And really having in a system and a schedule. I think if you're taking your integrity really seriously, I think you can structure and schedule those things. The other thing that I think makes nonprofits always feel like they don't have enough time is because we're on the front lines of major issues, is always feeling like we have to do everything all the time for all people. And so what can happen is that maybe there's some things we need to say no to, but we're afraid of, or maybe something doesn't really have the ROI that we need it to have, whether it's in fundraising or whether it's in program effectiveness. And so when that is going on, we can feel like, but I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. It's like, well, no, you have to do your data system correctly, and you do need to make these other phone calls or have this other thing. So I think sometimes it's a reluctance to say no to what we don't have capacity for that creates a lot of that those problems and a lot of burnout in the sector. So, and then as for staying in touch with donors, usually I find if you've got your two systems, you got your development records and your finance records, I find that development records tend to be more accurate because you're actually talking to people. So if you're really talking to them and you're recording those conversations and you're putting them in your database, what'll happen is that they moved, even if their checks are outdated and the finance system says, look, I have an old address. And you can say, oh, well, here's the address. I know they haven't changed over their checks, but they just told me, So I find that that's one of the things. And then when you don't know, pick up the phone. Any excuse you have to talk to a donor is a great one. When people are new to an organization, that's 3 months to, sorry, that's my alarm. I'm turning it off. That's 3 months where you could just be calling everybody you can. You can ask any question you want. You're not expected to know anything yet. It's a great time. When you're leaving, is another great time to start engaging a lot of people, making sure they're used to the next connection. If you're outside counsel, it's a great time. Like anytime you can be talking to people, it's really helpful, and do it on video right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's one of the areas that people forget about, which is they systematize the thank yous,
Yeah.
and that's great because getting a thank you is better than not getting any thank you, but
Hmm.
they, in a sense, sanitize the thank yous to the point where it doesn't have that emotional connection, that empathy, that real connection that you're talking about. Because if I have a conversation with you and we can talk about your family, we can talk about your job, we can talk about your health, whatever the issues that are going on in your life and whatever those are, if I know something about what's going on in your life, you're going to feel a much greater connection to me and to therefore to my organization than you're going to have if the only time you hear from me is that email or that year-end donor letter or invitation to the black tie dinner or the golf outing or whatever the case may be. And I think sometimes technology makes it so easy to get information out to a mass of people that
Hmm.
frankly I think people get lazy to a certain extent of picking up the phone and calling, or even just crafting an individual email that is clearly tailored to Elizabeth, not to 10,000 people in my database.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a really great point, and I'm glad you brought up about thank yous. I think one of the things I thought was interesting, was early in my fundraising career when Penelope Burke came out with her book on donor-centered fundraising, and people were really looking at like, oh, we're asking a lot and we're not thinking a lot, and people don't like it. And there has been some updates on the studies that she has done, but one of the things that really is prevalent in the sector is every year we lose 60% of our donors. And I think when you look at how we balance our
Repeat
activities,
that number for people again, because I think that's important for people to hear twice.
yeah, it's crazy. We lose 60% of our donors every year. So if you just think about, if you just kept 10% more of your donors, it would save you so much time and money. And the way our time is allocated is always getting the next dollar, the next dollar, the next dollar. And I get it. Like we have small staffs and we're running to keep on top of all of the programmatic activity as well as all the fundraising. But if you even look at the way, let's say a nice modest development department might be staffed, where maybe you have 5 people, you maybe have a development director, maybe you've got an events person, a grants person, maybe another mid-level fundraiser, and then at the bottom you've got your development assistant, who's the person who does the thank you letters. And as soon as possible that person gets out of that position. And it really, to me, shows how if one of the most important things we can do is thanking people, we wouldn't make that the lowest position on the hierarchy. We would make it a higher position with a higher title and higher pay, and we would put them in charge of a lot more thinking than just putting out these generic letters, as you point out. Now, I know that the large organizations like universities and hospitals are good at thanking. They say thanks 7 times, and they've got their major gift officer writing those handwritten notes and calling up. It's hard to do on small staff, but technology is helping. We can now segment our database and communicate in more effective ways. We can add notes on top of those generic thank you letters that go in. We can also make our generic thank you letters not so generic. I mean, make it as compelling and as interesting as the fundraising letter that got the gift in the first place. Tell another story. Get people interested in what you're doing. Get your board members involved in calling and thanking people. That's one of the things. As board members, we want them to do so much fundraising and they're terrified of doing it. It's really easy to call and thank people. They love getting those calls, and then the board members like doing it. So those are just great ways to just keep relationships.
And relationships are so critical. And I think one of the areas that most organizations struggle with is uh, I hear very frequently that their boards are not comfortable raising money, or that their board members don't like fundraising. And I think when you look at all of the elements that go into fundraising, there's tasks that everybody along the way can handle, right? And there's certain board members that probably shouldn't be the ones going to ask for major gifts or going to your high net worth individuals and large donors, just because that's not their comfort level. But there's so
Mm-hmm.
many other things that they can do to help. And as you talked about the importance of saying thank you, I've seen some great organizations doing exactly that, and just having board members call up maybe that mid tier of gifts and start thanking people and tell them, like, I'm not here to ask you for money today. I just want to tell you about some of the work we're doing, and thank you for everything, and listen, right? What's important to you? Why do you like our organization? What can we do better? Just opening that dialogue multiplies the connection to the organization and ultimately will probably provide a much greater return.
Yeah, and I think that is such a great point of like when you're having those conversations to ask those open-ended questions. It's so great when someone tells you, your newsletter isn't working, or they've been addressing it to their late husband for the last 3 years. I mean, you want to know that, like that piece of mail is destroying that relationship every time that goes into their mailbox, and to just have them tell you that. Those can only really happen when you're having those conversations and you're willing to listen to the answers, even when they're painful.
Yeah, it's a struggle, and you bring up an interesting point about destroying the relationship every time you get a piece of mail or email and something's misaddressed or names are misspelled, um, and it's really challenging because the data got into the system somehow,
Mhm.
and most organizations aren't going to be able to scrub that list properly on an annual basis to determine who is still living where, who might be alive, who might have gotten divorced, right? And now the gift that you were getting is going to the ex of a person who really is not favorably disposed to your organization. So there's lots of reasons to try to keep that updated, and I think that's really challenging. So, as you look out at sort of the current crisis, um, give us some examples of other situations that you've seen where groups have been able to effectively manage that communication in a time of crisis. That, yeah, we all know what's going on right now, and you don't really need to do much communicating of the crisis because everybody's pretty well aware of it. But in other situations, that's not the case. So how do you handle that?
Well, I think, again, we started the conversation really talking about trust. And I think that when people are willing to have a straight conversation, a factual and an unemotional conversation, unemotional not meaning that you don't refer to your own feelings in some way, but I think the emotion isn't in the way that it is communicated so that you're creating more feelings of upset for other people. But I think through organizations where I've worked at, where they've sometimes sent out white papers on a particular topic, or maybe I've been in a communication role for an organization. Maybe I've typically spoken on behalf of a founder and executive director, and all of a sudden all of those veils go down and that person speaks really directly in their own pure voice in a way that no one else could replicate. Those really hit home and they land in a way that it's magical, and I think it's just beyond your systems really. So I think those are some of the ways I've seen people be effective. I think when people take responsibility for things on their end, those can be very powerful. um, yeah, so those are some of the things that people can do. And I think one thing we've talked about in this crisis is, but this is true for anything, to look at it through the lens of your mission. You're really the only one who's thinking about your particular mission. So if you're a sports organization and you're doing something like after school for kids, maybe you know that your kids are going back into homes that are not safe for them if they're not in your program, or maybe you know that your kids are getting the food that they need, or maybe you were building up self-esteem and leadership skills that they're not going to get otherwise. And so I think as we're communicating about crisis, you know, focusing people back to the impact is always really helpful.
Yeah, and it's challenging, and it's frightening for the organization because they've invested so much in preparing for an event or an activity that's the basis of what their work is. And I think one of the areas that's getting lost in a lot of the organizations, certainly in our network, is that not only the fundraising really, but the program delivery, right? How do you continue to deliver programs to your constituent base when you can't get the kids together, when they're not in school and you can't get them together after school, you can't bring them together for a sports activity or to play. It's very hard for the organizations to continue to maintain that. And I think it's one of the areas that we're seeing some interesting initiatives in how groups are adapting to that, and how they're trying to engage the kids through social media, through virtual calls and networks, because sitting in front of a screen is really not a good substitute for playing soccer or basketball or baseball. And so how do you foster that active lifestyle when you can't really be there?
Yeah, and I think it's also compounded by not everybody having internet access. And we know that our libraries have often filled the gap there. And with people not being able to go to public spaces, that's also out. It's interesting, I have two kids. One's a grade school child, one's a preschooler, and seeing what the schools are doing, knowing that we have to do PE every day. So we have a choice board in which my daughter gets to choose her activities. I've also just been letting her run around outside. My kids are really cooped up right now. And so I think there are some interesting ways people can respond, but I think that that camaraderie is missing. Direct instruction is missing in a lot of ways. Like a piece of paper does not make up for a coach. So yeah, I think there are some real challenges there.
Well, Elizabeth, you've shared a lot of great information with us. Before we let you go, I want to make sure people know how to reach you. So why don't you tell everybody the best way to get in touch with you if they need some additional help and support?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, I can be reached. My cell phone number is 773-615-1938. I'm fastest on text. I can also be reached on email at, it's really my name, but it's Elizabeth J. Finlayson at gmail.com. And those are the two best ways to get in contact with me.
And before we let you go, I want to put you on the spot for a minute.
Uh-oh.
So now that we can't go out of the house, I've been anointed with some great superpowers where we can appoint you to be the commissioner of any of the sports that exist. I know you're going to have some tough choices ahead of you in terms of looking at what you can do, but let's pick the sport first.
Let's say baseball.
Okay, so as the baseball commissioner, you get to make one rule change or one, I guess, global change in perspective for the sport. What would you like to see different in baseball?
All right, one change. Well, I would say I would love it to be coeducational. So I would love to see men and women out there, and women who are great could make it onto the men's teams, and those that aren't, oh well, they can't, but that's what I would like to see.
Well, there's a lot out there, and certainly a lot of groups in our network that use baseball as a terrific tool for education and keeping kids involved and away from gangs and drugs and violence. And Elizabeth, I want to thank you for coming on today and sharing your insight with us. Really appreciate your support and your help. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Roy. I really appreciate you thinking of me and having me as part of this. And I wish all the organizations that are listening a lot of luck. Feel free to contact either of us to help you through this next few months. Happy to talk to anybody.
This is Roy Kessel signing off for the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. We hope you'll join us next week. Thank you.
Thanks.